Okay, Leah, is that up for everyone now?
I can see it.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kenning. I should start by saying that IRUS-UK, we're big fans of RAMP, and as Kenning said, we see our services as complementary. So on that note, let me dive in and tell you about IRUS-UK. IRUS stands for, quite simply, Institutional Repository Usage Statistics. We're funded by JISC in the UK, and our team members are JISC, who provide the hosting and service management. Cranfield University, we do the development and maintenance, and a group called Evidence Base at Birmingham City University, who carry out user engagement and evaluation. And IRUS-UK is part of a suite of services that are underpinned by JISC, all intended to deliver a connected national infrastructure to support open access. We are a national aggregation service for UK IRs and their usage statistics. We collect raw download data from a growing number of UK repositories for all item types. So like RAMP, data sets, articles, conference papers, whatever happens to be within repositories. Once we have raw data, we process those raw data into counter-conformance statistics, which I'll say a bit more about later, so that our stats are actually produced on the same basis as the traditional scholarly publishers, Elsevier, Springer, and so on. You can see from the chart that we started in July 2012 with just 5 repositories, and we now actually currently hold data for over 130 repositories, though over the years, a few of those have actually retired, so I think it's somewhere around 126 active repositories currently. As we say, we're counter-conformant. Counter started way back, I think in about 2002, when the situation was that various publishers were releasing statistics about the usage of their resources, but they were all produced on a different basis. And so publishers came together and formed counting online usage of networked electronic resources, designed to serve librarians, publishers, and intermediaries. It sets standards that facilitate the recording and reporting of online stats, and is intended to be consistent, credible, and comparable. Currently in force is particularly important is Counter Code of Practice Release 4, which is the code of practice that we follow for processing our raw download data into usage stats. And that applies to books, databases, journal, multimedia content. But as you can see, it actually that doesn't cover individual journal articles. A few years ago, though, Counter did release the first version of a Counter Code of Practice for articles, though it has to be said that actually hasn't been taken up by the scholarly publishers. Those codes specify in great detail how raw data should be processed into stats, and then how those stats should be formatted and delivered for reporting. So we collect raw download data from repositories. We do that employing something called the tracker protocol, and there's a link there for those of you that are interested in following this up. And in order to implement the tracker protocol, it is necessary to install a small bit of extra code into repository softwares. To make life easier, we do have patches, and in fact that information in the patches I forgot to update. We have patches for DSpace 3, 4, 5 and 6. I think we're just about to retire the patches for 3 and only support 4, 5, 6, which is the DSpace policy to only support the latest 3 versions. We also have a plugin for ePrints, which works with the newer versions of ePrints, as well as implementation guidelines for Fedora. And implementations have also been developed for Elsevier's Pure Portal and Figshare. Typically, to install a DSpace patch takes around 15 minutes. The ePrints plugin actually probably about 2 minutes these days, as it's available from the ePrints Bazaar. The tracker protocol was devised in collaboration with and is actually endorsed by Counter. This was a few years ago. We did a small project to see what pieces of data we actually need to pass from a repository to a central service for it to turn raw download data into stats. It's just a key identifier for whatever resource has been downloaded, and then the important attributes to do with that event, the date, time, IP, user, agent, referrer, and so on. So it's only a small amount of data. Typically, DSpace and ePrints send download data to us on the fly. Pure Portal and Figshare work slightly differently, and they send a daily digest of the previous day's activity once a day. So that's what we use to gather the raw download data. That gets sent to us, and we store that in daily log files, which we then subsequently process and ingest into our database. So we follow the rules specified in the Counter Code of Practice. We only obviously process entries from IRs that we recognize. So if we get stuff coming in from unknown IPs and servers, those get screened out. We sort and filter the entries following the Counter rules to remove robots using the Counter user agent exclusion list. In the Counter Code of Practice, this it's actually stated that this is regarded as a minimum requirement for excluding bots and so on. And so, as IRUS-UK and the repository it serves work in an open access environment, we found in practice within a few months of starting IRUS-UK that we did need to start looking at extra filters, and so we do apply some extra filters above the basic Counter minimum, and I'll come back to those. Entries are also filtered to remove double clicks as specified by the Counter 30-second double click rule. So the end result of that is the raw usage data we've collected into our logs is consolidated into daily statistics for each item, and then at the end of each month we can consolidate those daily stats into monthly stats, which is the granularity that Counter statistics work at. Now, back in the day when just about everything to do with scholarly resources was behind a subscription barrier, behind authentication authorization, the Counter robot exclusion list worked pretty well. As I've indicated, as we move into an open access world where all and sundry can get their hands on resources in repositories, and increasingly with publishers as they move towards OA as well, there is more that needs to be done. So above and beyond this user agent exclusion list, we also exclude several IP ranges, quite wide-ranging ranges, it has to be said, that are associated with known robots and spiders that don't nicely identify themselves. An example being Baidu Spider. Many of its hits on repositories, it actually identifies itself as a bot in its user agent string, but for a large number of visits, it appears to be a desktop browser. So we screen out a lot of robot usage that way. They're not the difficult ones. The difficult ones are more the spammers, hackers, dictionary attackers, and rogue users, general lunatics out there in the wild. And I performed quite extensive analyses a couple of years ago now, and empirically, by comparing what I was seeing and looking at thresholds and stuff, I found that we could significantly improve our detection of bots and bad users by excluding IP address and user agent combos with 40 plus downloads in a single day, or where a single item is downloaded more than 10 times in a day from one source. That nearly always inevitably turned out to be bad usage. I should say we use IP address user agent as a proxy for a user session, because obviously in the open access world you don't have the luxury of usernames and formal sessions generally. Even so, with what we've done, we're not satisfied, and we are aware that there is more that can be done. As Kenning has indicated, you know, there is a problem for us that we still overcount, and we're aware of that. I guess in mitigation, the one good thing is that if we do overcount, we overcount equally and without favour across all of our repositories, so that the stats are still comparable across repositories. I'll come back to robots a bit later. I won't dwell on this too long. It's just really to demonstrate that from the raw data we get going into our daily logs, there are a number of steps, and our ingest is quite rigorous and involves quite a few steps to ensure that we clean the data and convert it into stats. And you'll notice the very last step, actually, harvesting bibliographic metadata. We do that independently after the regular ingest. When I first started, I rather naively assumed that we'd be able to pick up metadata for items before we put them into our database. But in practice, I can tell you, harvesting from 120 odd repositories on a daily basis, quite typically 2 or 3, or on a bad day 4 or 5 of those repositories will be down. So if I was relying on having the metadata before we got the items in, I just wouldn't be able to run the ingest on many days. This way we record the event, we've got the key identifier, the OAI identifier of the item downloaded, so you know we can then subsequently later, when the repository OAI interface is up, we can go and collect that metadata. The month-end update is considerably simpler, because of course all the hard work is done in the daily ingest, but we keep tables of daily stats just for a few months, because those grow very, very rapidly. Obviously with over 120 repositories, those tables get enormous, and so although we do keep them going back 3 months so that they can be used if required on request on special occasions, they're there basically just to get the stats into the monthly granularity required for counter stats. Once we've got everything into our database, of course you need to get it out and access it, and all the usual suspects. We have our web portal, that is currently behind Access Management Federation Authentication Authorization. That's, in my view and my hope and the team's hope, a temporary measure. In the early days, I think our repositories, when the numbers were small, were worried about the sort of public exposure of all of these stats. A strange worry, given that most of them are already exposing stats within their own repository using other packages. But as time has moved on, we subscribe to the mantra open access, open data, open metrics, and it is our intention to fully open our portal one day. In addition to sort of basic views, we can do a lot of slicing and dicing of the stats from the IRUS-UK database, depending on the quality of metadata that we have. So obviously very easy to divvy up across repositories or across item types like articles or presentations or conference papers, but we're in the process of beginning to incorporate ORCIDs and funder metadata into our database as well, so that we will be able to provide per researcher reports reliably using the ORCID, and also report back to funding bodies on the usage of open access materials that they've funded the research. as well as looking at the reports in the web pages. They can be downloaded as tab separated, comma separated, or Excel spreadsheets. We also have two machine-to-machine interfaces, a traditional, I say traditional, SUSHI service. SUSHI is the Standardised Usage Statistics Harvesting Initiative. And that's the protocol that Counter adopted about, I think, getting on 10 years ago now. It's an XML SOAP service, and you can see more about that, but I would say that in about a year and a half, that traditional SUSHI will be retired and replaced by a new kind of SUSHI, which actually has grown out of work that we did at IRUS-UK. Typically, repository developers are more familiar with RESTful APIs and with JSON, and they're happier working with that than they are working with SOAP services. SOAP services are quite heavyweight and not always easy to implement, but having a RESTful API version of SUSHI, which returns JSON, has proved to be a lot easier, and that's become the basis of new SUSHI that Counter will be using, as I say, starting from 2019. For those that are interested, please do have a look at the example client. It's an early implementation of SUSHI. It's not the canonical version that will be coming out under the Counter banner, but it gives a flavor of the way it's going to work. That API is open and not behind a barrier, and we do already work with a number of repositories and other agencies who use that API to take UK IR stats from us. Just a few shots now of some of the basics we do. We produce more than half a dozen stats reports. We can also report on metadata, and we can do metadata views and what I call metastats views, so stats about our stats, as it were. And you can see from the year ends from 2012 onwards, we've been steadily increasing the number of repositories participating, and the total number of downloads we're seeing each year have been also steadily rising. And important in the open access world, of course, we can see the number of open access articles that are being downloaded from UK repositories. And since we started, our overall total now of downloads is over 100 million. We know about almost 1 million items in UK repositories. You can see stats at repository level, so it's possible to use IRUS-UK for benchmarking against other repositories. This is just the basic version, and it's only the top part of the repository report one. It's possible to slice and dice that according to sort of what bands or other criteria repositories might to compare themselves with other institutions. So useful for benchmarking, also useful to JISC and others to get an overall picture of activity across repositories in the UK. We also report down to item level for repositories. There are also reports for repository activity broken down by item type, and you can see that the total figures for each item are actually hyperlinked there, and if this was live portal, you could click through and actually get far more detailed statistics on individual items. That's kind of where we are now. I guess the question is, what next? As I say, there's a slight problem for us with Counter Release 4 in that Release 4 was designed before repositories were really regarded as major players, and therefore they weren't catered for explicitly in Release 4. So although we could follow the rules for processing raw data into stats, the reports we produce don't actually exist aren't defined in release 4. So we call them counter-like rather than official reports, and we describe ourselves as counter-conformant rather than counter-compliant. In order to be compliant, it's necessary to be audited on an annual basis. And clearly, if we don't produce reports officially listed in Release 4 at this stage, we cannot be audited. However, we've been through an audit review with the counter auditors, ABC, and that's actually helped to define what's required in the way of additional reports and how the counter code of practice might need to change to cater to serve repositories and other new services, as well as the traditional scholarly publishers. And of course, traditionally the counter reports have been targeted at individual institutions or consortia paying for subscriptions, and so it's also helped to frame how counter should work in an open access landscape where a publisher might want to deliver a report to the world and say this is the usage of our open access resources. This has led and contributed towards the development of a new code of practice for counter, the Release 5 code of practice, which will be coming into force in 2019. It simplifies and harmonizes the reporting requirements. R4 had, I think, about 3 dozen different reports. This has now been simplified down at its basics to 4 master reports at platform, database, title and item level, and from those master reports it's possible to derive a number of standard views based on use cases of people requesting stats. So we end up with fewer reports with increased flexibility, and the needs of repositories have been taken into account, so they're now integrated into R5. So on the back of that, we will undergo an official audit and become counter compliant at some point in 2019 as we adopt the processes specified in counter release 5. Back to robots. As I've said, the static lists of IPs and user agents, they're very useful. They're a quick way of getting rid of those you can easily identify. But as I alluded to, the difficult part is those that are trying to obfuscate and hide the fact that they are robots and that they're doing something nefarious. And a better way to do this is to come up with some statistical bases for dynamic filtering based on the observed behavior of IPs and user agents as proxy for use, don't forget. To that end, we have a counter robots working group. It involves publishers, repository developers, aggregators and a couple of other interested parties, and we've been working now on and off for 2 years to identify the most practical and generally easily applicable robot detection techniques. We've come a long way, and we're getting, I think, into the end game of our work, and we hope soon that we will actually be able to agree various metrics and thresholds for eliminating non-human usage, as I say, on a justifiable statistical basis. So we'll have some kind of science behind what we come up with. The trick is to make the detection algorithms easy enough for everybody to apply. We don't want to make it really difficult. You don't want to have to run an analysis for 26 hours on 24 hours worth of data, for instance. It has to be practical and usable. But even at the end of that work, when we hope to have a common set of rules above and beyond the static lists, there is this caveat. And this was stated in a report we commissioned by some consultants called Information Power about 4 years ago now, I think. And one of the things they said in their conclusions was that certain levels of activity, machine non-genuine usage is practically indistinguishable from genuine human activity. So when you get right down to a certain level level, you really cannot tell whether that was a person or a human. There's always going to be this little bit of fuzziness. Caveat noted, when our work is completed, Counter is intending to incorporate the results of what we've been doing into the Release 5 Code of Practice, so applicable across all Counter compliant services.
Paul, just to jump in here, we're at 11:46.
Oh,
so
right. I shall do 30 seconds and then I shall shut up.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I just wanted to jump in with the time limit.
Yeah, no, thank you. Sorry, folks, I can talk forever. I have been trying to constrain myself. We don't just do IRUS-UK. We also run a couple or three other services. IRUS-COAR for COAR, who aggregates research outputs from repositories worldwide. We also produce counter-conformance stats for the OAPEN library in the Netherlands, which is open access books. Also, the University of Amsterdam signed up for our services, and we are currently undertaking pilots to with people in the USA and soon in Australia and New Zealand. And of course, Kenning had already mentioned comparing IRUS USA with RAMP. And again, we don't act in a bubble. We're involved in Counter, in the Sushi Committee. We're represented on the Open Air Usage Statistics strand. And last but not least, definitely not least, we're also involved in the core interest group on usage data and beyond. I hope many of you would be familiar with the group. If not, please follow that link and take a look at the sort of things that the group does. And on that note, that's me done. Sorry, Leah.
No need to be sorry at all.